The morning Califen packed her belongings, frost had already crept inside the window panes, tracing white fingers across the glass, as though the house itself was trying to hold something in. She worked by candlelight before dawn, moving without sound through rooms she had known her entire life. Her hands found each object in the dark, the way hands do when they have touched something 1,000 times, when the body remembers what the mind no longer needs to direct. The quilt her grandmother had sewn from scraps of every dress the women in her family had worn since before the war. She folded it twice, pressed it flat against her palm, and laid it at the bottom of the canvas sack. Not because it was the most practical thing to bring, because it was the only thing left that still smelled like her mother. She did not cry. She had made that decision 3 weeks earlier, standing at the graveside in the frozen mud of the small plot beside the apple trees her father had planted, watching men lower her mother into ground so hard the gravediggers had needed 2 days and iron picks to break through. She had made the decision the way her father Hiram Fenn had taught her to make decisions about load-bearing structures and geological formations, by looking at what was true, accepting it completely, and then calculating what came next. What was true was that Margaret Fenn was gone. What was true was that Knox Rook had already consulted the lawyer before the funeral flowers had wilted. What was true was that this morning was coming, regardless of what Calla felt about it, so she might as well be packed and ready when it arrived. Knox stood in the doorway of what had been her parents' bedroom, watching her with his arms crossed over his chest. He was a broad man, 45 years old, with a gray-streaked beard he kept trimmed in a way that suggested he cared about appearances more than he cared about work. He had married her mother 3 years ago, when Margaret Fenn was a widow with a farm daughter and a mortgage that a woman alone could not service without a man's name on the deed. Calla had understood the transaction even then at 14. Her mother had understood it too. They had never spoken of it directly, but they had understood it together the way women in difficult circumstances learn to understand the things they cannot change. The law is clear. Knox's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had already won and knew it. Your mother's will names her husband as sole heir. The farm, the livestock, the equipment, the savings, everything. Calla kept folding. She pulled a wool shirt from the drawer, shook it once, folded it along the seams the way her mother had taught her. Mr. Brant will drive you to town at first light. After that, you are not my responsibility. He stepped further into the room, then moving with the comfortable familiarity of a man who believed he had earned what he had taken. He picked up one of Hiram Fenn's engineering journals from the shelf, turned a few pages with visible disinterest, and set it back down with a small dismissive sound. Your father left a lot of these, he said, theory and diagrams. I went through the whole collection, nothing worth $1. Calla looked at the shelves. The professional journals, the bound volumes with their embossed spines, the ones that looked like books a man would keep for their value, were gone. Knox had cleared them over the past 2 weeks, working through the room with the same sweeping efficiency he had applied to everything else her father had built, or owned, or loved. He had been searching for something. That was not the action of a man satisfied with the farm and a savings account. He believed Hiram Fenn had left something behind, something with commercial value, something that had not yet been found. And he needed Calla gone before she could find it first. She gave him nothing. No reaction, no acknowledgement, no flicker that might tell him she had understood what his searching meant. She folded the wool shirt and placed it in the sack and reached for the next thing. What she was actually looking for, moving through the room with the appearance of methodical packing, was the loose board in the floor beside the window. Her father had shown it to her years ago, pressing his finger to his lips with a quiet conspiratorial smile, lifting the board to reveal a shallow space beneath. Not deep enough for valuables, he had said, but deep enough for things worth keeping private. She found the board. She pressed her fingers along the edge. She lifted it. The space was empty. Nothing remained except a thin layer of dust and a dead beetle lying on its back, its legs curled toward the ceiling. She stood over that empty space for 3 full seconds and felt something shift inside her chest, something sharp and cold that was not grief but was adjacent to it, the recognition that Knox had searched more thoroughly than she had estimated. He was not careless. He was not stupid. He was simply ignorant of specific things, and the distinction between general intelligence and specific knowledge was her father had always told her the most important distinction in engineering and in life. She moved to the bookcase her father had built into the wall, the one with notched shelves sized precisely for the engineering journals he had spent his career collecting. Knox had taken the journals. He had not moved the bookcase itself. It was heavy, built from the same dense pine as the walls, and Knox was a man who hired other people to lift heavy things. Calla pressed her fingers along the bottom edge until she felt the seam. She tilted the case forward just enough, slipped her hand beneath, and found what she was looking for. The journal was thin and small, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp out, bound with a strip of leather her father had cut from an old belt. She did not open it. She pressed it flat against her body, tucked it beneath her wool shirt, and let the bookcase settle back against the wall without a sound. Knox was still talking from the doorway. She had stopped hearing him some time ago. When she walked past him with her canvas sack over her shoulder, he said something about gratitude, something about the generosity he had shown her by giving her until morning. She did not stop to determine which. Outside, the air hit her face like a flat hand. The temperature had dropped overnight, the kind of drop that announces a season has made up its mind. The yard she had known since before she could name it lay under a skin of ice that crackled under her boots with each step toward the barn. Ned Brandt was already there. He was 19 years old, the son of their nearest neighbor, and he had come at his father's instruction to help see Calla off in the morning. He stood by the barn door with his hat in his hands and his shoulders carrying the weight of something he had not yet decided whether to say. When Knox turned back toward the house, Ned moved closer and spoke quickly and quietly, the way a person speaks when they know the window is small. "Calla, he talked to the lawyer again last week, I heard through the fence. He's not just after the farm." He paused and his jaw worked for a moment. "He thinks your father left a map, something that leads to a hot spring or a mineral deposit, something that could be sold. He said the name of a lawyer in Billings, Franklin Lamb. Said your mother had used him for something." Calla looked at him directly. "You went and found this on your own." Ned did not answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper. "I wrote down the name and address. I don't know if it helps, but I know my father knew him, and I know your father trusted people who kept their word." He pressed the paper into her hand. "My father can't speak up. Knox loaned him money last winter. He can't afford to have that called in." He paused again. "It's not enough. I know it's not enough." "It's more than you know," she said. She looked at the paper. Franklin Lamb Billings, an address she did not recognize, a name she had never heard her mother speak aloud. But Ned had sought it out without being asked, had climbed over the wall of his own fear and his family's debt to bring her this one small piece of what she would need. That was not the action of someone looking for anything in return. That was the action of someone who still believed, in spite of everything, that certain things were worth doing. She tucked the paper into the bottom of her coat pocket, alongside the few coins she had saved to eggs sold quietly at the general store over the past year. Money Knox had never known about, because she had always known in some quiet and careful part of herself that a day like this one was possible. Mr. Brandt arrived at first light with his wagon and his silence. He loaded her single bag without meeting her eyes. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and his hand stayed a half-second longer than necessary, a gesture that held an entire apology he could not speak, because speaking it would have cost him something he could not afford to lose. They drove the 6 miles to Copper Creek without exchanging a word. The landscape on either side of the frozen road was the pale gray of early winter. The grasses flattened the creek, running low and dark between ice-edged banks. Calla watched it with the attention of someone memorizing things they are not sure they will see again. At the edge of town, before he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Harding's general store, Mr. Brandt reached into his coat pocket and pressed something into her hand without looking at her. 25 cents. 2 dimes and a nickel, warm from being carried close to his body. His jaw worked once, and what came out was quiet enough that the horse's breath nearly covered it. "I'm ashamed of myself, Calla. I want you to know that." She looked at the coins. She looked at the side of his face, the set of his shoulders, the hands holding the reins with unnecessary tightness. She understood that he was telling the truth, and that the truth was the only thing he had to offer. "I know," she said. "Thank you for the ride." He drove away without looking back. She understood that too. 78 cents. She stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of Harding's and watched the town begin its morning. Sheriff Goldie Coyne passed on the far side of the street, moving with the purposeful stride of a woman who had spent decades making decisions without asking permission. She was 48, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been weathered into something more honest than beautiful. She glanced across at Calla, and the look lasted precisely 1 second longer than a glance should. Not sympathy, not hostility. Assessment. Coyne knew Knox Rook. Everyone in Copper Creek knew Knox Rook because he had made certain of it, lending small amounts at carefully chosen moments, doing small favors that accumulated into obligations he could call in when he needed them. Coyne herself was inside that web. 2 years earlier, Knox had paid to repair the kitchen wall of her office when the roof collapsed in a bad winter. Not much money, but enough to exist as a thread between them. She did not stop. She did not speak. But that one extra second of eye contact said clearly what she would not say aloud. I see you. I know what happened. I am choosing right now to look away. And I know that I am making that choice. Calla filed it away carefully. Coyne was not an enemy. She was a person constrained by her own obligations, and constrained people sometimes became unconstrained when the balance of evidence shifted far enough. That was information worth having. The boarding house across the street wanted 75 cents a night. The church offered charity, but charity through Reverend Pope meant working for his cousin, who had a documented history of working her charity cases past the point of usefulness, and then releasing them in spring no better than they had arrived. The temperature was dropping. The sky had gone the color of dirty iron, pressing down on the town from all sides, and Calla understood that standing on this sidewalk, calculating options, was itself a form of action, the only kind available to her right now, and she would not waste it. She was running the numbers when the voice came from behind her. "You're Hiram Fenn's girl." The woman sitting on the bench outside Harding's was very old, 70 or thereabouts, wrapped in furs that had seen decades of hard use. Her white hair was pinned beneath a wool cap that had been repaired so many times the repairs had their own repairs. She watched Calla with eyes that did not match the rest of her eyes, that were sharp and still and precise as the blade of a well-kept knife. "He's been gone 6 years, Calla said. 6 years this coming February." The old woman nodded slowly, confirming something she had already suspected. "I counted. Good man, your father. Fixed something for me once when nobody else would touch it. Didn't ask for a single thing in return." She looked at the canvas sack on Calla's shoulder, at the coat that was a good wool, but not quite good enough for what was coming, at the particular quality of stillness Calla had been maintaining since she stepped down from Brant's wagon. "That man your mother married, he threw you out. The will is clear. The law agrees with him. Law being right and law being just are two different animals." The woman stood with the careful economy of someone who had learned over many decades that unnecessary movement was a form of waste. She moved with the deliberateness of a person who had decided long ago that energy spent without purpose was energy that could not be spent when it mattered. "Name's Maud Stowe. I've lived in these hills longer than most people in this town have been drawing breath." "Calla Fenn." Maud studied her for a long moment with unhurried attention, the look of someone conducting a genuine assessment rather than a social formality. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight?" "Not yet." "You got money for a room. 78 cents. Come with me. I want to show you something." She began moving toward the western edge of town, toward the hills that rose dark and pine-thick against the iron sky, and she did not look back to see if Calla was following. People who had something real to offer rarely needed to describe it first. Calla followed. The trail into the hills was invisible until you were already on it. Maud moved through the pines and aspens with the ease of someone navigating their own house, never pausing to check direction, never hesitating at a fork. Calla kept pace, adjusting the bag across her shoulder, watching the terrain, the way her father had taught her to watch it, not just the surface, but what the surface suggested about what lay beneath. Limestone country. She could see it in the outcroppings, in the way drainage cut certain patterns through the hillside. Limestone meant caves. Limestone meant water moving through rock in ways not visible from above. As they walked, Maud spoke without turning, her breath coming in small clouds. "Your father surveyed these hills about 15 years ago, working a contract for one of the mining companies that summer. He found things they didn't care about, things that didn't fit their purpose." "What kind of things?" Maud paused at a particular outcropping of pale rock and looked at it the way Calla's father had always looked at geological features, with recognition rather than curiosity. "The kind that keep a person alive in winter without burning a cord of wood." Then, after a longer silence, "I was in a mine shaft 20 miles east of here 15 years ago. Roof came down. Timber and rock buried me in the dark." Her voice was even the voice of someone who had processed this story thoroughly over many years. "I was there 3 days before anyone found me. Your father was surveying the mine for the company that owned it. He had no business being anywhere near the collapsed section. Calla looked at her without speaking. He heard me. Said later he heard my voice coming up through a crack in the formation. Sound travels through limestone differently than through open air. If you understand the acoustics, you know where to listen. Most people wouldn't have known. He spent 18 hours getting me out. Said he understood the structure, knew which timbers he could move, and which ones were holding the weight. She paused. The wind moved through the pines above them. When I asked him what I owed him, he said the world only works when people look out for each other. Said that was payment enough. They walked for 2 hours. The last daylight had gone thin and gray by the time Maud stopped at what appeared to be a natural fall of rock on the hillside, a tumble of limestone slabs half hidden behind a growth of dead brush, arranged with a naturalness that Calla's eye, trained by years of watching her father assess site conditions, recognized as deliberate. The randomness was too consistent to be accidental. Maud pulled the brush aside without ceremony, revealing an opening in the hillside approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, the edges worn smooth by water and time. Darkness beyond. And from the darkness, warmth. Not the sharp, dry warmth of a fire, something softer, more pervasive. The warmth of air that had been held at a constant temperature for a very long time. The tunnel was narrow and ran straight into the hill for perhaps 30 feet before it opened without warning into a space that made Calla stop walking and stand very still. The chamber was large, 40 feet across, at least the ceiling, arching 20 feet overhead, in a curve that reminded her of the drawings of cathedrals she had seen in one of her father's books. The floor was flat stone worn to something approaching smoothness by water that had moved through here over centuries and then gradually retreated. And at the center of the chamber, a pool perhaps 8 feet across breathed a steady column of steam into the cool cave air. The water surface moved in small, slow patterns that had nothing to do with wind or current. They were the patterns of heat rising of water in constant, gentle motion from below. Calla walked to the edge of the pool and held her open hand 12 inches above the surface. The heat rose against her palm in a wave that was steady and absolutely consistent, the temperature of a warm bath. And she understood immediately and completely what she was looking at because her father had written about it, and she had read those pages enough times to have them by heart. Geothermal. The word came out almost without her intending it. She straightened and looked up at the cathedral ceiling, reading it the way her father had taught her to read geological features as records of process rather than simply structures. Water rises from deep within the Earth's formation, picking up thermal energy from the rock far below, carrying that heat to the surface through channels in the limestone. The cave itself acts as an insulator, the pale stone absorbing warmth from the water and releasing it slowly into the surrounding air over hours and days. A ventilation shaft, she located it by the movement of steam, kept the humidity from building to the point of discomfort. This space would hold warmth through any winter on record because no fire ran without fuel, and this ran on nothing a human being needed to provide. Maud watched her without expression for a long moment. Then quietly, "Your father taught you well. He taught me to understand how things work." Maud moved to a boulder near the pool and sat with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about cold and damp. The warmth in the cave was already working on her, the set of her shoulders easing her breathing, slowing. "I found this place 40 years ago," she said. "Told nobody, too useful to share with people who would ruin it." She stood again after a moment and moved through the chamber with the familiarity of someone who had spent real time here, pointing out the sleeping area near the wall where the rock radiated strongest, the storage alcove in the back where the air was drier and the temperature more stable, the cool edge of the pool where the water was safe to drink. She pointed to how the heat gradient worked across the chamber, strongest at the pool's edge and diminishing toward the walls, but never dropping below the mid-50s even at the farthest points. "The water comes up at 104 degrees, keeps the air consistent regardless of what's happening outside. Coldest winter I spent in here, 1862, temperature outside went to 40 below and stayed for 3 weeks. In here it never dropped below 56. She paused near the tunnel entrance, preparing to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow, bring canvas for the entrance, some rope tools. After that, you're on your own." Calla looked at the chamber. At the pool, steady and warm. At the walls, pale limestone, holding decades of accumulated warmth. At the ceiling with its cathedral curve and the ventilation shaft dark above. "Why me?" she asked. "Of all the people you could have chosen." Maud stopped without turning. Because your father saved my life with knowledge, not muscle. And I heard what Knox Rook said when he filed that will with the county court. Heard it from someone who was there. She turned her head just enough that Calla could see the sharp profile of her face in the dim light. He said Hiram Fenn left nothing worth having. A pause. I wanted to prove him wrong. Then she was gone, the sound of her footsteps fading down the tunnel, the scrape of brush being pulled back across the entrance, and Calla was alone in a chamber that had been waiting patient as the stone that held it for someone who needed it. She sat near the pool for a long time, and then she opened her father's journal. She had not read it since the night in the barn, and she did not read it the way she had read it then. Then she had been a child reading her father's voice in the dark, holding the sound of him against the silence. Now she read it as the only person responsible for her own survival in a place that would keep her alive exactly as long as she understood how it worked, and not one day longer. The words looked different under that kind of attention. Every observation her father had written, every careful notation about heat and stone and water looked like something he had written for this exact moment, this exact reader, this exact situation, which she understood now, reading the final page again, in the swirl of geothermal steam and pale limestone walls was precisely what it was. He had known such places existed. He had understood exactly how they functioned, and he had written it all down, hidden the journal under a bookcase, and trusted his daughter to find it. Knox Rook had looked at a man's life's work and seen nothing worth keeping. She felt something settle in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite determination, but some combination of the two that had no simple name. She thought about the empty space under the floorboard and the thoroughness of Knox's search and the journals he had taken believing they held something valuable. She thought about the last page of her father's letter, the words pressed hard into the paper. The earth does not stop giving heat because winter comes. The winter is only what happens on the surface. Below, the heat continues exactly as it always has, indifferent to the season. You are my daughter. You understand how heat moves. Use that. She closed the journal, wrapped it carefully back in the oilcloth, and tucked it into the deepest part of the canvas sack, where it would be protected from moisture. Then she lay back against the warm stone and listened to the winter settling over the Montana territory outside, and thought about heat moving through rock. And sometime before dawn, she slept better than she had in 3 weeks. November came in hard, and it stayed. The cold that settled over the Montana territory in the first week of that month was not the tentative cold of autumn's end. It was something with weight and intention, the kind that moved into a landscape the way a serious occupant moves into a house, rearranging everything, making clear it planned to stay through spring, whether spring was ready for it or not. Each morning, Calla pulled the canvas seal aside, and the air hit her face at temperatures that had no interest in negotiation. Inside the cave, the thermometer Maud had left on the first day hung steady at 58 degrees. She built her days around a single question her father had applied to every engineering problem he ever faced. What is the most efficient use of available resources to achieve the required outcome? She did not wander. She did not experiment without reason. She moved through the hills in patterns calculated to gather maximum food with minimum exposure, minimum tracks, minimum evidence of her presence in any particular location. 3 snare lines in concentric rings at increasing distances from the cave entrance, rotating which ring she checked each day so that no single approach path became worn enough to be visible from a distance. The rabbits came regularly in the first weeks. The cold had driven them down from the high country into the lower brush where food was marginally more available, and they were not yet wary of wire they had not learned to fear. Maud returned the morning after as promised. She arrived before first light, timing her approach for the dark hours when anyone watching the hills would have less visibility. She brought canvas for the entrance frame rope, a knife with a handle worn smooth from years of use, a coil of snare wire, and news. Knox was in town yesterday afternoon asking questions at the general store, wanting to know if anyone had seen you where you might be staying. What did people say? Nothing useful to him. Most people in this town owe Knox a debt of one kind or another. He's been strategic about that, lending small amounts, doing small favors, building up credit he can call in when he needs it. Maud set down her load near the entrance and began sorting materials with the practiced economy of someone who had done this in many circumstances. But owing a man money is not the same as caring what happens to his stepdaughter. People kept their mouths shut because they had nothing useful to say, not out of loyalty to you. Don't mistake the one for the other. I won't. Maud paused in her sorting. He also spoke to a man named Holt Mudd. She said the name without particular emphasis, the way you state a weather condition, something that affects your plans without being alarming in itself. Mudd does tracking work when he can get it, hired by people who need to find things they've lost track of or people they want to locate. Knox told him he believed you might have taken something valuable from the farm before you left. Maps, survey documents, something with commercial worth. Calla looked up from the snare wire she was examining. I took my grandmother's quilt, my father's personal journal, and my clothes. I know that. Knox doesn't, or rather Knox has decided to believe something else because something else is more useful to him. Maud met her eyes steadily. He's convinced himself that Hiram left a treasure. Gold from the mining surveys, perhaps, or maps that lead to something worth finding. He thinks you know where it is. Calla thought about her father, about the man who had kept his personal journal hidden under a bookcase because its value was not the kind that could be seen by someone who did not already understand what they were looking at. The man who had spent 18 hours digging a stranger out of a collapsed mine because the world only worked when people looked out for each other. The man who had worked for wages his entire career, saved what he could, and left it all to his wife and daughter in a world that Knox Rook had replaced with a forgery. My father never had treasure. He was an engineer. I know what your father was. Maud said it quietly without any inflection that required a response. What matters is that Knox has hired Mudd to find you, and Mudd is good at what he does. He won't move quickly. He's methodical. But he'll start narrowing possibilities. You need to cover your tracks when you go to town. Vary your route. Don't let anyone follow you back. Over the 3 days that followed, Maud taught, not with lectures, but with demonstration and question, showing Calla how to use the hot spring as a cooking apparatus, the water at the pool's edge just below scalding enough to soften dried meat and heat liquids without any fire at all. She showed how to identify the edible plants still findable in early winter, which water sources in limestone country were safe and which ran too close to mineral deposits to trust. On the third day, they built the entrance seal together, fitting canvas to the branch frame, closing the gaps with strips of cured hide. When they tested it, sealing the entrance and sitting quietly for 20 minutes, the temperature in the chamber did not drop a single measurable degree. Maud sat beside the pool and looked at what they had made. When the real cold comes, you seal this at night. She looked at Calla. You understand closed systems. What you put in, you get back. And this spring has been putting heat into this cave for longer than either of us will live. On the morning of the fourth day, Maud prepared to leave. She stood at the entrance with her coat buttoned and looked at Calla with those sharp eyes for what felt like the last proper assessment she would make. I'm 71 years old. Winters are getting harder. I may not be able to come back as often as I'd like, if I don't come when you expect me. She paused, and in the pause was everything she was not going to say about age and mountain trails in deep winter. Don't come looking for me. Stay warm. Stay fed. Stay hidden. I understand. She reached into her coat and produced a small, folded piece of paper, a rough map of the hills around the cave, key landmarks marked in her careful handwriting, including 2 other springs on the hillside marked with small crosses. If something happens to me this winter, you'll find a letter in my cabin behind the loose stone in the fireplace. It contains information you may need. She pulled the brush screen back across the entrance from outside. Her voice came through the canvas, slightly muffled. The earth keeps you warm, Calla. Everything else you have to earn. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hillside, and then the forest absorbed them completely. Nora stood alone in the cave with the pool steaming beside her and the map in her hands, and 78 cents she no longer had any immediate use for. She looked at the 2 crosses Maud had marked on the hillside and filed them away carefully as information that had no obvious application yet, but would have one eventually. She was right about that sooner than she expected. The first week of December, when her flour supply dropped to a level that required a trip into Copper Creek, Calla took the longer route down, checked her back trail twice, and traded 4 rabbit pelts at the general store for flour and salt. She was loading the flour into her bag when the sound of wagon wheels on the frozen street pulled several people in the store toward the window. Calla did not move toward the window. She continued loading her bag. She already knew from the quality of silence that fell over the room and from the way the store clerk straightened his spine exactly who had just arrived. Knox Rook pulled his wagon to a stop in front of the hardware store across the street. He was wearing her father's coat. She recognized it immediately, the particular cut and color of the beaver pelt that Hiram Fenn had worn on cold weather surveys the coat that had hung on the hook beside the farmhouse door for as long as Calla could remember. It was too large across the shoulders for Knox. He moved inside it with the stiffness of someone whose body had been fighting a losing battle against inadequate heat for weeks. When Knox stepped into the store and saw Calla, his expression moved through surprise and settled into something that wanted to be contempt, but had something else underneath. Something that looked like relief, like a man who needed her to be worse off than she was and was disturbed to find she was not. Still alive. The words came out with the specific lightness of someone who had rehearsed indifference. I figured the cold would have settled that by now. Calla shouldered her bag. I'm managing. Where do you sleep? Charity House. One of the cribs behind the saloon. The store was very quiet. 8 people finding reasons to examine merchandise they had no intention of buying. Calla felt something shift in her chest, not satisfaction, but the precise calibrated awareness of someone watching a system burn through its reserves at an unsustainable rate. Knox had taken everything from her and stood here in a dead man's coat believing he was the warmer system. He was wrong about that. He simply did not know it yet. I have a place, she said. Warm enough. Warmer than yours, probably. Knox's face tightened. He had expected something from this encounter, tears perhaps, or the visible signs of suffering. He had not expected a smile. He had not expected the word comfortable. He left the store without buying what he had come for, and Calla watched through the window as he climbed back into his wagon and drove north toward the farm, and she felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. She felt the awareness of someone watching a system spend down what it had accumulated and understanding that winter was still months from finished. The wolves came in January's last week precisely when the temperature dropped to 30 below and stayed there. She heard them for 2 nights before they found her snare lines. On the 3rd morning, she walked her nearest snare ring and found it destroyed. Not sprung destroyed. The wire torn the bait consumed the wolf tracks pressed deep into the snow in a pattern that told a clear story. They had spent time here investigating thoroughly and they would come back. She reset the snares a 1/4 mile further from the cave. The next morning the same. Rebound again another 1/4 mile. The morning after that she stood at the edge of her farthest ring and counted wolf tracks and understood that she was not dealing with a random pack moving through. These animals had identified her operation and were systematically dismantling it, following the logic of her movement with the same patient efficiency she applied to her own work. She recalculated. Without the snares producing reliably, her food supply had 19 days of margin, not quite 3 weeks. The cave kept her warm without any fuel cost, which was an enormous advantage, but warmth did not feed her. On the 9th night of the wolf siege, lying near the pool with the journal open across her knees, she permitted herself something she had been refusing to do since October. She looked directly at the worst version of the numbers. 19 days. If the snares continued to fail, if the wolves did not move, her body was burning calories at a rate the food she had could not sustain indefinitely, and that rate had a terminal point. She was not someone who panicked, but she understood the difference between optimism and calculation. And calculation required looking at the actual numbers, not the comfortable version of them. She turned the page and kept reading. The relevant passage was in a section her father had written during a survey in Wyoming, noting the behavior of a wolf pack near a geothermal feature with unusually high sulfur output. The concentration of sulfur compounds in the water and surrounding stone was sufficient to function as a territorial deterrent to large predators. Not a learned aversion her father had written carefully, but something deeper, an instinctual response to conditions associated with environments hostile to survival. The smell signaled danger at a level below conscious thought. Calla looked at Maud's map, the 2 springs marked with small crosses. She studied the terrain notation around the northern one and understood from the elevation and the drainage pattern that this spring sat closer to a deeper thermal source, which meant a higher likelihood of elevated mineral content. She went in the early morning of the 10th day. The spring announced itself from 30 yards out. The water at the center was too hot to approach closely, and the stones around its edge were stained yellow and orange by mineral deposits laid down over centuries. She gathered a dozen of those stones in her bag, handling them with strips of canvas to avoid transferring her own scent to the placement locations. She set the stones in a wide arc around the perimeter of her snare territory, rebuilt the destroyed snares inside the arc. Then she went back to the cave and waited. 4 days. The wolves tested the perimeter twice. She could track their approach and retreat in the snow. A careful investigation followed each time by abrupt withdrawal. On the fifth morning, their tracks stopped at the sulfur stone line and turned back. On the sixth morning, there were no new tracks at all. They had moved on, finding the cost-benefit calculation of this particular hunting ground no longer favorable. She ate well that night for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. She was thinner than she had been in October, her coat hanging differently, her belt moved in by 2 notches. But she was not starving, she was not defeated. Her father had found the answer 12 years before she needed it in a Wyoming field, writing about the smell of sulfur and the behavior of animals in a landscape that operated on the same physical laws. Everything else did readable if you understood the language. It was while she was eating, sitting near the pool in the warmth that had not wavered through the entire siege, that she registered the marks in the snow near the cave entrance. She had come in from the north and entered without completing her usual circuit of the south-facing approach. One lapse because she was tired and the wolves were gone, and she had let herself have a moment of reduced attention. The boot prints were not hers. Difference had different tread pattern. Someone had approached from the south and stood near the entrance long enough to leave overlapping impressions before moving away toward the eastern ridge. The prints were several hours old. Whoever it was had come and gone, but they had found the entrance or come close enough to matter. She did not sleep well that night. Ilamames came through the entrance on a morning in early February, and the first thing Calla heard was the specific, irregular rhythm of a person navigating difficult terrain while managing equipment, someone whose arms were occupied and whose balance was being managed consciously rather than automatically. She was on her feet with the knife in her grip before the brush screen was disturbed, positioned against the cave wall in the shadow position. She had rehearsed enough times that her body found it without instruction from her conscious mind. He came through the tunnel and into the chamber and collapsed near the pool with the boneless thoroughness of a body that had spent its absolute last reserves reaching the warmth and had nothing remaining for the task of staying upright. He was young mid-20s with the kind of face that would weather well, but had not yet begun to. The equipment strapped across his chest marked him before his words did a leather transit case of the kind surveyors use for precision instruments, and beside it a map roll in a waterproof tube that had been worth protecting even when the man carrying it was half frozen. He did not see her. His eyes were closed against the warmth he was absorbing, his breathing shallow and rapid. His hands were badly frostbitten at the fingertips, white shading to waxy yellow. No feeling in them yet, or he would have been moving them. She watched him for the full minute before she spoke. "Don't move. Stay where you are. Let the warmth work." His eyes opened. He located her with a careful movement that did not involve his head identifying the voice's source and the knife in her hand simultaneously. His expression moved through confusion toward a particular kind of alertness, not panic, but the heightened attention of someone doing rapid assessment. "I'm not armed." His breath came in visible puffs. "I'm a surveyor. I saw steam rising from the hillside and followed it. I thought it might be a cabin." "It's not a cabin. I can see that." A pause in which he appeared to be deciding something. "My name is Elam Ames. I work for the Montana Mining Company. I've been caught in the open since yesterday afternoon. I lost my bearing in the flat light and spent the night in a snow shelter. This morning I followed the steam." Calla looked at the transit case, the map roll. Equipment that showed real field use wear patterns consistent with months of regular handling, not recent acquisition. "What are you surveying?" "Geothermal features. Hot springs, thermal vents, anything indicating subsurface mineral deposits." His voice was steadier than his condition had any right to produce. "I was working a grid pattern on the eastern ridge when the temperature dropped faster than my barometer predicted." "You came from the east." "Along the ridgeline, about a mile out, I started following the steam rising from this hillside." Calla looked at the boot prints she had found 2 days ago. The size, the tread, and the direction of approach from the south did not match what he was describing. She filed the discrepancy carefully and asked the question that would resolve it or expose him. "Who assigned you the reading materials for your training?" The question surprised him. "Clarence Webb, senior surveyor out of Denver." "Why, Did he require you to read the geothermal survey reports from the Yellowstone Basin, the ones from 1871 and 1873? Elam's head came up from the pillow of his own arms. Something shifted in his face, the specific recalibration of a person encountering unexpected information in an unexpected place. Those reports are required reading for every surveyor Webb trains. The methodology in them is still the most reliable approach we have for mapping subsurface thermal features through surface indicators. Webb calls it the Fenn method. He looked at her with the full attention of someone who had just understood something. The author's name was Hiram Fenn. He was my father. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a significant thing settling into place. Your feet need treatment, Calla said. At least 2 weeks off them, possibly 3. She moved to the storage alcove and began gathering what she needed. You'll stay here while you recover. When you can walk properly, you leave and tell no one about this location. Elam received this without argument, understood and agreed. He was unconscious within the hour, his body redirecting everything it had toward repair rather than function. And he remained mostly asleep for the first 3 days, surfacing periodically to eat what Calla prepared, and then subsiding again into the deep sleep of serious injury recovery. She worked around him, conducting her daily operations with the adjustment of someone who had planned for 1 and was now managing 1.5. On the 4th day, he was consistently awake, and they talked the way people talk when they are confined in a warm space while the world outside is actively hostile, and silence would be too heavy to carry. He described his training and his fieldwork across 3 territories. The senior surveyor who had assigned him her father's published reports not as supplementary reading, but as foundational methodology. He described what the Fenn approach had meant to his understanding of his profession with the precision of someone speaking about technical matters they genuinely respected. Calla contributed the unpublished parts. The observations in the personal journal, the thermal measurements from specific sites her father had surveyed, but never written up formally because the companies who hired him were not interested in the theoretical dimensions of what he found, only the commercially applicable results. Elam listened with the attention of someone receiving something genuinely valuable. There's a formation 2 miles southeast of here, he said on the 6th day, unrolling his map across the flat rock she used as a table. I was trying to reach it when the temperature dropped. Based on the surface indicators, I believe there's a substantial geothermal feature there, possibly significant enough to be commercially relevant. My father surveyed this area in 1872. He wrote about that southeastern formation. She found the relevant passage in the journal without searching. He said the surface indicators suggested a deeper thermal source than this spring. He didn't complete the survey because his contract ended and the company didn't renew it. What did he think it had potential for beyond mineral extraction? Calla thought about the marginal sketches, the speculative drawings her father had made in the journal's margins when the professional entries were finished. Not technical drawings for a report, but the working sketches of a man imagining applications that did not yet exist. Pipe systems running through floors, buildings warmed from below, communities drawing heat from the earth the way they drew water from wells. He thought the earth could heat homes, she said, directly without burning any fuel. Elam was quiet for a long moment, looking at the pool, at the steam rising from it. With the patience it had maintained through every development in this cave since October, through wolf sieges and frostbite, and the weight of a winter that was breaking records no one had wanted set. He was right. It was on the 9th day when Elam was mobile enough to move around the chamber, but not ready for outdoor conditions, that he told her about Holt Mud. He did not preface it or soften it. He simply told her what he knew because she needed to know it. Mud was in the saloon the night before I started the survey. He was drinking and talking louder than he probably intended. He told the man beside him he was working a job for a rancher north of town, looking for a runaway stepdaughter who had taken valuables from the property. Said the rancher believed the girl knew where her father had left something worth finding. Calla stood at the pool's edge and processed this without visible reaction. He said he had narrowed the search to the western ridges. That steam rising from this hillside in cold weather would be visible from the valley floor on a clear day. A beat of silence. The boot prints near the entrance 2 nights before you arrived. Calla said it as a statement. Elam met her eyes steadily. That was me. I came from the east along the ridgeline, and I circled the southern approach before I identified the entrance, then moved east toward the ridge before dark. I came close to the entrance, saw it, and kept moving. He paused. I should have identified myself then. I understand why finding those prints afterward was alarming. That was a failure on my part. Calla looked at him for a long moment, measuring the consistency between what he was saying and what she had observed over 9 days of close quarters. Mud is working a grid from the east, she said. Methodical. He'll reach this ridge in 2 weeks, maybe less. I know. Elam looked at the map rolled on the table, then back at her. I can stay. My survey is suspended until the weather breaks. The company isn't expecting reports until March. I have equipment useful for monitoring movement on the ridgelines, and 2 sets of eyes are better than one. He watched her face for a response she was not giving him. I'm not offering out of pity. Your father's unpublished observations about this formation are professionally significant. Staying benefits me as clearly as it benefits you. Calla thought about closed systems and their limits, about what her father had written about the efficiency of systems that accepted genuine additional inputs versus systems that hoarded their resources past the point of effectiveness. You stay until you can walk properly, she said. You contribute food gathering, watch rotation, whatever your feet allow. You keep this location to yourself regardless of what happens after you leave. She held his gaze with the same directness she had held Knox's in the bedroom doorway on the morning she left. If you break any of those conditions, I will make it my business to ensure your professional reputation carries consequences you will live with for years. Elam received this without offense, which was itself a piece of information she stored carefully. Understood and agreed, he said the same words he had used before, meaning them the same way. 3 days later, Maud did not come on the day Calla expected her. She did not come the following day either. The storm that moved in on the first of those days was serious, the kind that reduced visibility to arm's length and drove the temperature below anything the season had yet produced. Wind at velocities that made the pine trees sound like something in distress. Calla and Elam sealed the entrance with every layer they had, canvas and hides, and a spare piece of wool blanket wedged into the lower gap. And inside the cave, the temperature held as it had always held, indifferent to the catastrophe outside. They could hear the world trying to come apart and feel none of it except the sound. By the morning of the third day, when the wind had dropped enough to make the outside world navigable, Calla understood what the absence meant before she opened the entrance. She understood it the way you understand certain things, not as a shock arriving from outside, but as a weight settling into a space that had been quietly preparing to receive it. She found Maud at the base of the north-facing slope. The old woman was half covered by a drift that had built around her in the hours since she had stopped moving. She had been coming toward the cave. Her direction was unmistakable. She was carrying a pack that contained dried meat, a folded blanket, 2 tins of crackers, and a letter sealed with a small bead of red wax pressed with her thumbnail. The only seal she had. Calla knelt in the snow beside the woman who had given her the cave and the knife and the snare wire and the map of the hillside and 3 days of teaching that had saved her life more than once by this point. And she stayed on her knees in the freezing air for a time she did not measure. The cold pressed in from every direction. She did not feel it. Elam came out without being asked and helped her build a cairn from stones on the hillside, working without speaking. When it was done, Calla stood and looked at what they had made and said into the wind, "The earth keeps you warm now." Inside, near the pool that had not changed its temperature by a measurable degree through any of it, Calla opened the letter. Maud's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the intention of being legible. The penmanship of someone who understood this was a document that might matter in ways her previous letters had not. The letter confirmed everything. Margaret Fenn's real will had left the farm and all its contents to Calla. Maud had been present at the signing as witness. The document Knox Rook filed with the county court after Margaret's death was a forgery. Maud's certainty was not speculation, but direct knowledge. She had seen the real document, and she had later seen the one Knox filed, and they were different in every material way. At the letter's end, the name appeared again. Franklin Lamb Billings, his professional address. Maud's confirmation that he was still alive, still practicing, still possessed of a memory reliable enough to testify to exactly what he had drafted. Elam sat across the pool and watched Calla's face while she read, and when she looked up, he already understood the general shape of what the letter contained. "The railroad opens in 3 weeks," he said. 4 at the outside. Mud will reach this ridge in 2. They looked at each other across the steady rising steam of a spring that had been running since before either of their fathers had drawn a first breath. Calla folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the oilcloth with her father's journal so that the two documents rested against each other. Hiram Fenn's knowledge and Maud Stowe's testimony, the two foundations on which everything that came next would have to be built. "We wait," she said, "and Knox is coming. I want him to come here." Elam looked at her with the specific quality of attention he had been directing at her work. In her thinking for 2 weeks, the attention of someone who had found an intelligence operating at a level he respected. He did not argue. He trusted the calculation. But the calculation had a number in it that neither of them spoke aloud, and the number was this: 2 weeks before mud reached the ridge, 3 weeks before the railroad opened, and somewhere in the space between those two facts, everything that Calla had spent the winter building was either going to hold or it wasn't. Ned Brandt came up the hillside 2 days after Maud's cairn was finished, moving faster than a person should move on iced ground, which told Calla before he opened his mouth that whatever he was carrying had not allowed him to be careful about it. She met him outside the entrance. He had found his way without being shown, which meant he had asked someone or followed someone or worked it out from the direction she always came and went when she appeared in town. Any of those possibilities was worth noting. "Knox threatened my father," he said, without preamble, without greeting. "He told him that if my father didn't go to Sheriff Coyne and say he knew where you were staying, Knox would call in the loan before the end of the month. The full amount. We don't have it. Does your father know where I am?" "No, but Knox thinks he does." Ned pulled his hat off and held it in both hands. "My father is considering it. He won't have a choice to make if there's nothing to tell, but Knox doesn't know that, and right now the pressure is real." Calla looked at him in the thin February light, at the effort it had cost him to climb this hill again, to bring her this warning, knowing that doing so put his family further into the exact position he was trying to help her escape. He had given her the Lamb name in October, when he had nothing to gain from it. He was here now for the same reason. "Go back and tell your father that he doesn't need to know anything. Tell him the situation is going to be resolved directly within the next few days." She paused. "And Ned, this is the second time you've climbed this hill with something I needed and nothing to gain from it. My father said the world only works when people look out for each other. I think he was right about that." Ned put his hat back on and went down the hill faster than he had come up, and Calla watched him go and thought about the specific texture of courage that had no audience and expected no reward. Inside, she told Elam what Ned had said. Elam listened without interrupting and then was quiet for a moment. "Knox is applying pressure to everyone he can reach," he said. "That means he's feeling the walls closing. He's heard about Lamb. He knows what Mud found. He's coming here himself." "Yes." Elam looked at the cave, at everything that had been built inside it over 4 months. "How do you want to handle it?" Calla had been thinking about this since she read Maud's letter. She had thought about it the way her father approached structural problems, not from the outcome backward, but from the available materials forward, building toward the strongest possible configuration with what actually existed rather than what might be wished for. "I don't want to meet him in a courtroom first," she said. "Not yet, not before he's seen this." She meant the cave. She meant the organized sleeping area and the storage alcove stocked with 4 months of careful management, and the pool that had not changed temperature by a measurable degree through the worst winter in territorial memory. She meant the evidence of what knowledge looked like when applied consistently over time. She wanted Knox to walk into this space before she said a single legal word to him, because some arguments were made with facts and some were made with the physical reality of a thing, and the physical reality of this cave made an argument that no document could fully reproduce. "You want him to see what he couldn't take from you," Elam said. "I want him to understand what he failed to see." They spent the next 2 days preparing, and the preparation looked nothing like fortification. Calla arranged nothing artificially. The cave was exactly what it had been since November: the organized sleeping area, the storage alcove with its carefully managed provisions, the cooking arrangement at the entrance, the pool steady and steaming. Journal open to one of her father's thermal diagrams on the flat rock she used as a table. She had not staged it. She had simply lived here, and living here, with the rigor she had brought to it, had produced a space that made its own argument to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Then on the second morning of preparation, Sheriff Goldie Coyne appeared on the hillside. She came alone, moving with the directness of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it before she started climbing. Calla met her 50 yards below the entrance. They stood in the cold with their breath making clouds between them. Knox came to my office yesterday, Coyne said. He wants me to arrest you for theft. Says you took survey maps from the property before you left. I took my father's personal journal and my grandmother's quilt. I know. Coyne looked at the hillside above them at the faint thread of steam barely visible in the cold air. She was quiet for a moment. Your father told me something once years ago when I was in a position I'm not proud of. He said law can be right and still not be just, and the people who enforce it have to know the difference. She met Callah's eyes. He was talking about a situation I was mishandling. He was right. You're here to warn me. I'm here because I owe a debt I've been carrying for 6 years, and I should have paid it sooner. Coyne looked at the entrance, then back. Knox is planning to come up here himself. Mudd told him where you are. I can't stop Knox from doing that under the current legal standing. But I can tell you it's coming. I want him to come. Coyne studied her with the expression of someone reassessing an estimate. You have something. I have enough. I need Knox to stand in a specific place when I tell him what I have. Coyne was quiet for a moment. Then when it's done, you come to my office. Whatever you've got, I want to see it properly recorded. She turned to go, then stopped. There's a judge named Jerome Hamby making his circuit in 6 weeks. He's honest. He's the one you want. She went back down the hill and Callah watched her go and understood that the balance of the town had shifted in the night quietly without anyone declaring it the way thermal energy shifts through stone. Elam rehearsed his role without being asked to. He would be present, visible, the certified professional witness. He would speak only if legally necessary, and he would not speak first under any circumstances. This was Callah's conversation, and he understood that without needing to be told more than once. On the third morning after Ned's visit, Callah monitored the southern approach from the ventilation shaft, using the narrow vertical angle that let her see a slice of the hillside below. One figure moving upward through the trees, slowly with the labored gait of someone whose body had been fighting a losing battle against cold for months and was not recovering the ground it had lost. Knox came alone. Holt Mudd had delivered the location and withdrawn from the situation. Whether the certified witness had changed his calculation or whether Knox's credit had simply run dry, Mudd was not with him. He was a professional, and professionals in his trade maintained contingency plans that did not include personal exposure when the institutional weight shifted. Knox pulled the brush screen aside and came through the tunnel, and the moment he stepped into the chamber, he stopped moving entirely. He was wearing Hiram Fenn's coat. He had been wearing it since October, but it fit him differently now. He had lost significant weight over the winter, 30 pounds or more by Callah's estimate, and the coat that had been too large across the shoulders in December now hung on him as though it understood it had been made for a different man and was no longer pretending otherwise. His face had shed the fullness that came with comfortable living and left behind a structure that was angular, harder stripped of the particular authority that ease confers on men who have never had to calculate the gap between what they have and what they need. He looked at the cave. He looked at the pool with its patient column of steam. He looked at the pale limestone walls, the organized sleeping area, the storage alcove, the journal open on the flat rock. He looked at Elam beside the storage alcove with a length of iron pipe in his hand and a certification case visible on the rock beside him. Then he looked at Callah standing at the pool's edge, and something moved across his face that she had not expected and had not prepared herself for. Not contempt, not the calculation of a man still looking for an angle. Understanding. The specific, uncomfortable understanding of a person who has been wrong about something important for a long time and is encountering the evidence of that wrongness in a form too physical and too complete to argue with. So this is it, he said. His voice was rough from cold, not quite steady. This is how you did it. This is how I did it. He walked further into the chamber slowly, as though the space itself required a different kind of movement than he was accustomed to. He stopped near the pool and looked down at the water for a long moment, at the small patterns the heat made on the surface, the constant gentle motion of something that had been running since before either of them existed. I burned through 60 cords, he said. The savings are nearly gone. The cattle died in January, all 38 of them frozen in the pasture before I got them to the barn. The farm will sell for a quarter of what it was worth in October if I can find a buyer at all. He said this not as confession and not as complaint. He said it the way Callah listed her food supply as inventory, the flat recitation of a person who had run the numbers and reached the bottom of the column. I know, Callah said. He looked at her. You know, I've been tracking it. Knox was quiet for a moment. The pool breathed between them. Mudd told me you'd contacted a lawyer in Billings. Franklin Lamb. He drafted my mother's real will. He keeps records of every document he has ever prepared. He has kept them for 40 years. She let that settle before she continued. I also have a written statement from Maud Stowe, certified by Elam Ames as a professional witness, attesting that she was present at the signing and that the document you filed with the county court after my mother's death does not match what she witnessed. The sound of Knox's breathing changed slightly. A man who has been holding a particular tension for months, releasing it 1 degree at a time. Maud Stowe is dead. Her testimony isn't. Elam's voice came from beside the storage alcove, measured, carrying the weight of professional authority without raising itself. A written statement produced before a witness's death and certified by a credentialed third party is admissible in territorial proceedings. I have certified the document. Miss Fenn has the original. Knox sat down on a boulder near the pool's edge. Not because he was invited to, because his legs had reached the end of what they would do without rest. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the water, the heat rising from it, the mineral smooth stone around its edge. The cave was very quiet. The sound of water moving deep in the limestone, the faint hiss of steam meeting cooler air, the almost imperceptible creak of the ventilation shaft in the wind outside. I kept it, he said finally. The words came out with the quality of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. The original, your mother's real will. I don't know why I kept it. He reached into the inner pocket of Hiram Fenn's coat with a hand that was not entirely steady and produced a folded piece of paper. The creases worn soft from many foldings and unfoldings, the edges beginning to separate at the corners. I told myself it was insurance, something to hold over someone if I ever needed leverage. But that's not really it. He held the paper in his hands and looked at it without offering it. Maybe I kept it because throwing it away felt too much like admitting what I'd done, and I hadn't finished admitting it to myself yet. Calla crossed the space between them and took the document from his hand. She unfolded it, carefully smoothing the worn creases, and read her mother's handwriting. Margaret Fenn's deliberate cursive, each letter formed with the care of someone who understood the weight of what she was setting down in ink. The farm, the livestock, the savings, the equipment, all of it to Calla. Explicitly, unambiguously, the date of signing, the witness signatures. Maud Stowe's name among them, written in the same careful hand that had written the letter now resting inside the oilcloth with Hiram's journal. Her mother had tried to protect her. The protection had been erased and then recovered and was now in her hands. She stood with the document for a moment without speaking, letting herself hold the full weight of what it was. Not the legal instrument, though it was that. The intention behind it. Margaret Fenn, who had known she was dying, who had made the arrangements she could make, who had put her daughter's name on paper with the faith that paper would hold. There was one more thing, Knox said. He was looking at the pool again, at the steam rising patient and constant. Your father's personal journal, the leather-bound one. I took it in October with the professional volumes from the shelf. I didn't read it. A pause. I threw it in the fire with some other papers I was clearing. I didn't know what it was. Calla looked at the storage alcove. At the shape of the oilcloth bundle inside it, the journal she had taken from beneath the bookcase before she left, tucked against her body while Knox talked in the doorway about gratitude and the law. He had taken the professional journals from the shelves, the visible ones, the ones that looked valuable. He had missed the one hidden beneath the furniture because finding it required knowing it existed, and knowing it existed required understanding that a man like Hiram Fenn kept two kinds of records, the ones the world could read and the ones meant only for the person who already knew where to look. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more completely than words could. I'll go to coin, Knox said. He stood from the boulder with the deliberate effort of someone managing a body that had become unreliable over a winter spent fighting inadequate heat. He straightened himself inside Hiram's coat with the last piece of dignity available to him, and it was a real piece, not a performed one. I'll tell her what I did, the will, the forgery, all of it. All. He met Calla's eyes with the directness of a man who had moved past the point of managing appearances. Not because I've become a good person, I haven't, but because you have enough to finish me in court, and because 3 days ago you could have left me in the snow on this hillside and you didn't. Calla held his gaze. She thought about what leaving him in the snow would have made her. She thought about the calculations she had run in the seconds before she made the choice she made and what her father had said about the world and the conditions required for it to work. "The farm will sell," she said. "Whatever it brings you keep. I'm not asking for money." She folded the will once and held it. "I'm asking for the truth to be on record. That's what my mother wanted. That's what Maud witnessed. That's what Franklin Lamb will confirm when Elam reaches him." She looked at Knox with the same steadiness she had brought to every difficult thing since October. "You go to Coyne and tell her exactly what you did. Then we're finished with each other." Knox moved toward the tunnel entrance. At the threshold, he stopped and turned part way, not quite looking back, not quite looking away. "He left you something I couldn't see well enough to steal," he said. It was not an apology, it was an observation, and it was accurate, and he knew it was accurate, and that was its own kind of accounting. Then he was gone. His footsteps on the frozen ground were slower than Mud's had been more careful, the sound of a man descending a hillside with attention, because the cost of a fall had changed. Elam set down the iron pipe and exhaled slowly through his teeth. "He'll go to Coyne." "Yes? You believe him?" Calla looked at the entrance, at the pale winter light filtering in around the edges of the canvas seal. "He kept the original will for 4 months when burning it would have been safer. He came up here alone. He could have brought Mud, and he didn't." She turned back to the pool. "People who keep the evidence of their own wrongdoing are people who haven't finished deciding what they are." He made his decision today. She was right. Knox walked into Coyne's office before sundown that same day. Coyne listened to the full account without interrupting, with the expression of someone whose categories for understanding a situation were being rearranged while she watched. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had not been given accurate information before, and she was receiving it now in a form she could not dismiss from Knox's own mouth, with a certified witness already on record, with Margaret Fenn's handwriting on a document that left no ambiguity about intent. When Knox finished, Coyne looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked up. "I'll need Elam Ames's formal certification filed with the court, and I'll need you available for Judge Hamby when he makes his circuit. 6 weeks." "I'll be available," Calla said. Knox was taken into a holding room before the end of that day. Not dramatically. There was no crowd, no scene. He walked with Coyne to the back of the office, and the door closed, and outside the winter evening came down over Copper Creek with the same indifference it had brought to every other evening since October. Calla stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment with her canvas sack over her shoulder and the will in the oilcloth bundle against her chest. The same sidewalk she had stood on in October, with 78 cents in one direction to walk. The town looked the same. She was not the same. Elam left for Billings 4 days later when the railroad opened with the first tentative break in the cold. He carried certified copies of Maud's letter, Calla's formal deposition, and a letter of introduction from Coyne, who, having decided which way her conscience actually pointed, moved with the efficient directness of someone who had been waiting for permission to use it. The conversation with Franklin Lamb took 40 minutes because Lamb had kept his records and his memory was as reliable as Maud had believed. He was 67 years old and still precise, a man who had spent 4 decades matching words to legal intent, and understood that the truth in this case required very few of them. He had drafted Margaret Fenn's will in the spring of 1886, 6 months before her death. He remembered its contents clearly. He could account for every difference between what he had drafted and what Knox had filed, and he was prepared to say so before any court that asked. He had been prepared to say so for some time, he told Elam. He simply had not been asked. Judge Jerome Hamby arrived in Copper Creek on his circuit 6 weeks after Knox's arrest. A man of 60 with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that reaching conclusions too quickly was a form of carelessness he could not afford. He heard the testimony without visible impatience, without any indication of which way he was leaning, until he was ready to indicate it clearly. Lamb's testimony was precise and unambiguous. Coyne submitted her own account of Knox's voluntary statement. Elam's certification of Maud's letter was entered into the record. The original will in Margaret Fenn's handwriting was placed before the court. Hamby did not deliberate long. The farm and its associated property had belonged to Calla Fenn since the moment of her mother's death. The document filed by Knox Rook was fraudulent. His subsequent actions constitute deliberate obstruction and the willful dispossession of a minor. The record will reflect all of it. Knox Rook went to the territorial prison outside Helena for 3 years. He left Copper Creek on a morning in April when the snow had finally begun pulling back from the lower elevations and the creek was running high and cold with snowmelt. Calla was not present at his departure. She had nothing left to witness there, and she had learned over the winter the practical value of not spending attention on things that were finished. Holt Mudd had disappeared before the arrest warrant was issued. He was a professional, and professionals in his position maintained exits they did not advertise. Some people said California. Others thought north into Canada. Calla did not spend time on the question. He had delivered a location and withdrawn from a situation that had become more complicated than the fee justified. That was the entirety of what he had been, and it was over. She sold the farm in May when a ranching company arrived from the east with their survey teams and their appetite for land that had survived the worst winter in recorded history and still showed productive soil beneath the damage. They paid fairly, not generously, and Calla accepted the price because what she needed the money for was not comfort, but foundation. She bought the parcel of hillside that included the cave, the spring, and the slope above it where Maud's cairn stood, now visible again as the snow retreated. She completed the purchase through the county land office, with Elam standing beside her, his certification case on the desk between them, his signature alongside hers on the purchase document. She paid with money that had traveled a long route to reach its purpose, from the farm her father had built to the savings her mother had kept to the transaction Knox had tried to make permanent, back now into the hands it had always been meant to reach. The proper burial happened in late May, when the ground had softened enough for digging. Calla carved the headstone herself from a piece of the pale limestone that characterized the hillside, working with tools borrowed from the hardware store, and returned with careful thanks. The letters were not perfectly uniform, but they were deeply cut and would last longer than anything that required maintenance to survive. Maud Stowe, 1815 to 1887. She taught others to listen to the earth. Coyne came to the burial. Ned Brandt came standing straighter than he had in October, carrying himself like someone who had made a decision about what kind of man he intended to be and was working on making it true. Two women from town who had known Maud in her earlier years came and stood quietly and left quietly. Elam stood beside Calla. When the others had gone and the afternoon light was moving long and golden across the hillside, Calla stood at the headstone alone. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you sat on that bench and waited for me to come out of the store," she said. "You knew the timing. You knew who I was before I knew who you were going to be to me." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind in the pines above and the faint mineral scent carried down from the spring. "I didn't know you long enough, but you knew exactly how long was necessary." The cabin took the whole summer to build. Elam designed the pipe system. His professional training applied for the first time to residential warmth rather than commercial extraction, and the design incorporated observations from Hiram's marginal sketches in ways that would take Elam's colleagues in the field years to recognize as significant advances in applied geothermal engineering. They laid pipes in the floor that carried hot spring water beneath the living space, warmth rising through the boards in a slow and even radiation that required no tending, no fuel, no decision each morning about whether there was enough wood left. The earth did the work. The earth had always been doing the work. They were simply learning finally to receive it without wasting effort fighting the terms. Elam and Calla were married in the autumn of 1891, on a day when the hillside above Copper Creek had gone the color that gave the town its name, and the air carried the first edge of the cold that would come in earnest within weeks. The minister was young and new to the territory and did not know the story of the previous winter. Calla thought that was appropriate. Stories of survival do not require witnesses who already know the ending. Elam said what he said and meant it in the way that things mean something when they come from direct experience rather than aspiration. "I found you in a cave with a knife in your hand, and you made a decision about who I was that I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of. You showed me that the work I do with instruments and maps is only valuable when it starts from the humility of understanding what the earth is already doing. I intend to spend the rest of my life learning from you, and I have not had cause to regret that intention once." Calla held his hands in the autumn light and said what was true. "I was 17 years old with 78 cents in a journal I didn't fully understand yet. The world had made its decision about what was going to happen to me. The earth disagreed. She looked at him and at the hillside behind him and at the thread of steam barely visible above the cave entrance, patient as it had always been. You helped me build something that belongs to both of us now. That is not a small thing. That is most of everything. The years accumulated the way years do in Montana, with full commitment to each season's particular demands. They had children who grew up knowing that the floor of their house was warm because the earth beneath it was warm, who learned from their mother to read the land as a record of process rather than simply a surface to move across, who understood, without being formally taught, that knowledge was the one form of wealth that could not be burned through in a single hard winter. In the spring of 1937, Calla Ames was 67 years old and sitting on the porch of the cabin that had been warming itself from below for 46 years. The pipe system Elam had designed still functioned and maintained now by a younger man in town who understood enough of the principles to keep it running, though the original installation had required almost no intervention because systems built on solid understanding tend toward persistence. Her granddaughter Lottie was 15, sitting on the porch step below her with the quality of attention that Calla had learned over a lifetime to distinguish from its imitation. Real attention had a particular stillness to it, a forward lean that was barely perceptible, an economy of movement that came from not wanting to miss what came next. Lottie had it. She had her great-grandfather's way of engaging with the physical world, the instinct to understand the mechanism rather than simply use the result. "Tell me about the cave," Lottie said. "All of it from the beginning." Calla looked at the hillside above where a thread of steam was just visible in the cool spring air, faint against the blue of the morning sky. She thought about a frost-covered morning and a canvas sack and the smell of her mother's quilt. About a bench outside a general store and an old woman with eyes that did not match the rest of her. About the feeling of pressing her hand above a pool of hot water in a limestone chamber and understanding immediately and completely what her father had written and what it meant and what she was going to do with it. "The winter of 1886 was the worst in the territory's history," she began. "The snow started in November and didn't stop until March. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. People burned their furniture to stay warm." She felt the warmth rising through the porch boards from the pipes below, the same warmth that had been rising through these boards since before Lottie's mother was born. "I didn't burn anything. The earth kept me warm." Lottie looked up at her with the expression of someone who understood this was not a story about weather. Calla reached into her coat with the same gesture her father had made on winter evenings, when the work was finished and the fire was banked low and there was nothing left to do but think and produce the oilcloth bundle. She unwrapped it with the care of nearly 5 decades of careful handling and held the journal out to her granddaughter. The leather was dark with age, the binding worn at the corners, the oilcloth creased from more foldings than anyone had counted. But the pages inside were still clear, the ink still legible, her father's handwriting still as precise and considered as the mind it had come from. Lottie took it with both hands, turning it over, feeling the weight of it before she opened it. "Your great-grandfather wrote that," Calla said. "I read it when I was 17 in a cave by the light of a hot spring, while the worst winter anyone alive had ever seen tried to erase everything it could reach. I read it until I could use it, and using it kept me alive." Lottie looked up. "What if I don't understand all of it?" Calla smiled, and it was the same smile she had given Knox Rook in Harding's General Store on a December morning when he needed her to be suffering, and she was not the smile of someone who possesses something the world has not found a way to take from them. "Then you'll learn. The journal isn't a test, it's an invitation." She looked at the hillside, at the steam rising from the place where the earth had been giving its warmth freely for longer than any human reckoning in this territory, longer than the territory itself, longer than any name that had ever been put to this particular piece of ground. "Knowledge doesn't diminish when you pass it on," she said. "It multiplies. Maud Stowe knew that. Your great-grandfather knew it. It is the one thing that works in the other direction from everything else, the one thing that grows by being given away." Lottie opened the journal to the first page and began to read. Calla watched the particular quality of concentration settle into her granddaughter's face. The slight lean forward in the stilling of the hands, the eyes moving across the page with the specific purposeful speed that meant understanding was happening and not merely recognition. The spring kept flowing. It had been flowing through the founding of the territory and through the winter that had tried to end a generation and through a courtroom proceeding and a wedding and the raising of children In all the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life built on a foundation the earth provided without charge to anyone who understood enough to build there. It would be flowing after Lottie and after Lottie's children, carrying heat from the deep places to the surface, with the patience of a process that required nothing from human beings to continue and only benefited from human intelligence when that intelligence arrived humble enough to work with what was already there rather than against it. Calla sat on her warm porch in the spring light of 1937 and listened to the hillside and felt for the first time in many years something very close to the feeling she had had on the first night in the cave. Not the fear that had preceded it or the exhaustion that had followed it, but the thing in between, the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be in exactly the right relationship with what surrounded her. Her father had understood this long before she did. He had written it down and hidden it where only she would think to look, trusting that she would know when she was ready to find it and that finding it would be enough. He had been right about that, the way he had been right about the limestone and the heat and the patience required to receive what the earth offered to those who learned to be still enough to feel it. He had been right about all of it.